Back in the late 90s, Unreal had quickly become an odd series in that it had incorporated elements from different modes of storytelling into the first-person shooter composition, and then its makers abandoned the formula for another development philosophy. The original installment had a heavily linear, suspenseful, story-driven shooter style that ran for several levels of trap-filled castles, alien ruins, caves and spaceships. The second game, on the other hand, helped develop the then emerging arena shooter subgenre, and then the tools for their making became even more widespread in the industry, and turned out to be what the name Unreal has been most known for ever since. As Alan Williamson, co-writer of the book Na Pali, A Journey to the Unreal, puts it, Unreal, as the name suggests, remains somewhat enigmatic and otherworldly. Overshadowed by spin-offs, the fruits of its engine and Valve's genre-defining Half-Life, it never quite got the recognition it deserved. A blend of science fiction and fantasy was the conceptual force behind the development of the first title by Epic Mega Games. Naturally, throwing another first-person shooter at the PC audience when first-person shooters were saturating the market was no small feat. What has made such a peculiar franchise stand out over the years, and what is its current state? This set of 2 videos will focus on the original Unreal, Unreal Tournament 99, and Unreal Tournament 2004, with flashes of commentary on Unreal 2, Unreal Tournament 3, and the brand new Unreal Tournament, currently under development. Also, the videos will contain plotline details from the single-player campaigns, details without which the overview of the writing and general story development would be incomplete, especially for the original game. So beware. What a timely entrance. 1998, a year in which shooters were undergoing their second wave of popularity, and names like Blood and Quake 2, as well as other first-person experiences such as Hexen 2, were an inseparable part of the gaming imaginary. How to approach FPS tropes was a constant aspect of Unreal's planning, since Epic didn't want to introduce yet another action-centered shooter with vaguely named levels and excessive gore, although Unreal had quite a lot of the latter. Lead designer Cliff Bleszinski says, "We were working our butts off to make a collective vision of something that was beautiful and interesting and compelling. It was a world that gamers wanted to explore that was rich with beautiful environments and interesting alien creatures and fascinating locales. The team added a touch of sci-fi aesthetic in space and immersive sound accompaniment in order to inspire the player with a sense of loneliness and entrapment, courtesy of Alexander Brandon and Michiel van den Bos, who would later work on Unreal Tournament 99 and Deus Ex, and now on the upcoming UT. Prisoner 849 begins the adventure with a clean slate. The player can choose gender, species, and the color of their gear as no more than their status of incarceration in a number is informed by the game. The protagonist is on the Vortex Rikers, a prison spaceship, when an accident and crash on a mysterious planet chucks the player right into the narrative. The story has a neat touch of interstellar colonial power relations. The Nali, natives of the game's major setting, the planet Na Pali, are subjected to cultural and resource exploitation by reptilian humanoids called Scar, who are said to come from the stars, as repeatedly stated in the Nali's wall inscriptions. The way some of the concepts of submission and enslavement are presented in the game resemble cargo cults, with the native burlesque worship of the 8-ball gun, which they call Stick of Six Fires, or the way in which they end up blaming themselves for the coming of their enslavers. The game depicts a conflict between a civilization that is rooted in spiritual traditions and superstitions, and one that is raw in its display of power. The choice is way too clear so that the player can identify that the game is a shooter first and foremost, and that they can be sure of whom to kill. Story is far from being the main instrument of engagement and interaction, but it's there to color level progress, as well as the game's space and aesthetic, very important elements in Unreal. Speaking of spaces and level design, Convoluted corridors lead to ancient alien atriums that strike the player multiple times with delightful surprises. Secret rooms here are a creative breath of fresh air from the simple tactile attempts of Doom and Wolfenstein 3D, following what Quake had nicely formulated. Areas that are often out of the player's line of sight, or simply require a different approach to level exploration. Take these Na Pali for instance. They are no more than peaceful ascetic individuals that want nothing to do with gunfighting or the scar. Stumbling upon these docile creatures without harming them will sometimes direct the player to secret areas filled with assorted goodies that they are more than willing to share after being spared their sweet ritualistic life. That's right, a game whose genre's name contains the word shooter encourages the player to rethink their killing drive. Here a conflict between a Scar brute and one of such defenseless Na Pali is about to end in certain bloodshed, but if the player is quick enough to get in the way, the four-armed Gnostic anchorite walks them to a secret room that contains a weapon upgrade. Indeed, the Na Pali are inseparable from the landscape of the game, but they are not merely pieces of random access memories scattered across the maps. They are an active part of it, whether the developers put them there to conceptualize the game's locations or to help shape the narrative or how the puzzle mechanics and exploration work. Here is another situation in which there can be more than mobile elements of the game's space. This particular one wants to guide the player character to a raft at the end of a corridor so that they can cross a stream out of the ceremonial chambers. The problem is that a Scar awaits at the dock. The whole scripted sequence that's there to ensure that the Na Pali is on the player's side doesn't actually happen if he gets hit by Scar fire and retreats in fear. So a little walking ahead prevents him from getting hit, eliminating the Scar in the way, and prompting a sequence that teaches a lesson in the process back in 1998 about how level design in a shooter can tell a story while also doing the usual job of providing the player with exciting combat opportunities in an engaging space. As a result, the continuity of level design is closely linked to story progression, something that would be further popularized in other first-person shooters such as Half-Life and the more immersive sim-oriented System Shock 2. Unlike the previous FPS blockbusters Doom, Quake or Duke Nukem 3D, Unreal's levels reveal mysteries of the plot along with its linear design, with gradual changes in environment that are subtle enough for the player to feel in a cohesive narrative, despite the fact that several people designed different levels for the game. Such a structure may be taken for granted in modern linear shooters, but it wasn't back then. And that's what's beautiful about Unreal's narrative. These diegetic elements are not reduced to visual decoration. They exist to establish an atmosphere of escape through uncharted and treacherous paths. Prisoner 849 is merely a witness to a decaying civilization, not having the chance to contemplate what is causing Na Pali's demise before it's too late. Alan Williamson mentions that juxtaposition of the ship's metallic carcass teetering on the edge of a waterfall evokes the feeling of a spoiled paradise, a world corrupted. As you explore this strange place, you start to question who the real alien is around here. When walking through the various environments, the player can feel the uncanny aura of a world under change of power. Notes, diaries, wall inscriptions, and other sorts of texts found throughout tell of past events, problems and anxieties that no longer require solutions. The only future for the people lies in a few prophecies, which the player character can manipulate to their own interest, or simply follow as an alternative language for game objectives. Na Pali itself, now just a place to be broken out of, and not a bland one. While on the way to the end of the game, the player is given numerous sites of carefully crafted level art through diverse and colorful textures and appropriately placed buildings, walls, mountains, and general objects. In Unreal, the mise-en-scène plays a substantial role in how the player is going to receive the narrative. Paths are not there simply to be walked along, but also surrounded by contextualized architecture, interactive art and objects, and other spaces that make the Na Pali's planet and plight look and feel authentic, credible, worth caring about. The expansion Return to Na Pali was released shortly afterwards, developed by Legend Entertainment. Following the end of the original campaign, Prisoner 849 is rescued by a warship while stranded in space, and is then sent back to Na Pali in order to locate another ship, the UMS Prometheus, Legend Entertainment adopted a more open-ended style of level design, especially early on, allowing the player to explore the many points of interest in the maps as they see fit. But that ends up looking more like a way to make the campaign longer than an effective strategy that makes sense for the action and story world of the expansion. The player can oftentimes find themselves walking about the same areas and buildings without there being any practical reasons for these objectives to be so far apart. Tracking is here a gameplay element in and of itself, and there is no substantial or singular art development or level mechanisms to make that tracking worthwhile. Story progression is uninspired, so are the new weapons and enemies. Voice acting is horrendous.
I believe I'm getting closer to the Prometheus. I can feel it.
And in the end, the expected plot outcome is achieved with a minor twist and the campaign is over. Reviews? Well, not that favorable for the most part, but that was not enough to tarnish the reputation of the main game. It's hard not to appreciate the sophistication in Unreal's narrative and systems, and the truth is, it's neither about one thing nor the other, but about a subtle balance that works well for many different tastes. The game is likely to strike a chord with those looking for a masterful 90s shooter with an excellent array of weapons and outstanding AI and physics. With those looking for a shooter that contains a compelling story, or with those looking for all the previous options plus suspense, puzzles and immersive level design. Groundbreaking features of the game include the first ever incorporation of deathmatch bots created by programmers, which would make the success of the tournament games possible. But the series would still have one more installment based on linear, story-driven, single-player action. Informed Unreal enthusiasts who lived in the late 90s and couldn't wait for the second single-player title probably knew from some news outlets that Legend Entertainment would make it. And knowing the mediocre product that Return to Na Pali had been, they probably feared what would come out of it. Unreal 2 hit the market in 2003. 4 years prior, the spin-off Unreal Tournament had consolidated several gameplay features from the first title, despite having focused on a more competitive format. Unreal 2 stayed away from many of those things. Weapons were different, and that wouldn't be a problem were they not uninventively different. Enemies bore only a vague resemblance to the threat and mystique that the ones in the first title had inspired. Voice acting and cinematic sequences took over the narrative and often got in the way of the ongoing action, with no reward in terms of instigating storyline build-up.
Hey, Ida, does your guidebook list this as a vacation spot for Scar?
He's probably checking up on his Caesarean grunts. I don't like this, John.
There is no mystery or sense of displacement, both in setting and in combat. The player character is now a fully voiced and playful John Dalton, an ex-marine sent on a mission that he doesn't fancy in order to fetch fragments of a generic alien artifact. There is nothing fundamentally unreal here, which the first game encapsulated so brilliantly. The uncanny nature of the previous story world turned into regular space warfare FPS structure. Story presentation and level design, two things that made its predecessor so powerful, are toned down here. Level design fails way too often, especially with the inclusion of spaces that serve absolutely no interactive purpose. What's this room for? And this hatch? As for story presentation, the over-exposition to an otherwise shallow plot through silly cinematic narrative resembles the unnecessary sluggishness of Doom 3. The difference is that here, the gameplay itself is dull and sluggish, and that takes the frustration of playing Unreal 2 a step further. It remains to be known why the Legend Entertainment team decided to develop movement mechanics this way. A solo campaign was a driving force behind the original game, and a weak venture in Unreal 2, and many were disappointed. But between Unreal and its sequel, a new kind of phenomenon would hit the scene.